So let me start off and say good afternoon. I'm Liz Hume. I'm the acting CEO at the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and it is my pleasure to be here and to talk about this really critical issue of police reform, reimagining public safety in the United States. We have some incredible speakers here today. First is Alan Charles Chipman. He's the faith-rooted organizer and strategist for Initiatives of Change USA. They're based in Richmond. We have Lisa Broderick, who's the founder and executive director from Police to Peace. And we also have Jim Chief Bierman. He's a former chief of police, Redlands, California, and he is a Department of Justice strategic site liaison. So we have some incredible speakers here who are immersed in this issue about what do? How do we know we have this urgent need to reimagine public safety. We also know that we have an urgent need to address police use of force and police-involved killings. That is an urgent need. But beyond that, we also need to reimagine our public safety and also deal with and dismantle structural racism that we know is impacting this really critical issue. So with that, I want to turn it over first to Alan Charles and have him talk a little bit about the history, where we are, what do different communities think about this, and then we'll talk with Chief Jim to hear, to think about it from someone who's been working in the police and also consulting with or working directly with the Department of Justice now. And then Lisa Broderick to talk to us about what is possible, what is happening. We want this to be a discussion, a lively discussion. So, please, all the panelists, if you have a question, while Lisa's talking, for example, just jump right in and pull it out. I want to also introduce Theo Sithler, who is not only a senior fellow at the Alliance for Peacebuilding, but is also working with us as a long-term consultant on U.S. peacebuilding, policy and advocacy, and really focusing on the reforms that are needed from our policymakers and lawmakers, both in the White House, the administration, and in Congress. So he's also going to be helping me moderate today. So I welcome all of you. And Alan Charles, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, great. Well, yeah, my name is Alan Charles Chipman. I work for Initiatives of Change USA. We are a peace-building organization, and my work really queries around history and the legacies of racism and dehumanization, specifically within the United States context. One of the things that I love to say is just because something is current doesn't mean that it is new. And as someone who used to work in insurance and trained as a counselor, one of the things that I'm trained to do is to see patterns. And as we know, patterns that can emerge in the past can inform us of what's happening in the future. And so we are in a moment, yet again, within United States history, where people are looking at the institution of policing and are questioning what is the future of policing, and more importantly, what is the future of public safety. And so there are people that vary on different ranges. There are some who say that this system can be reformed. There are some who view on the opposite side of the spectrum, perhaps, that believe that abolition of the policing institution needs to happen and that there needs to be a different model of public safety. Throughout history, I have a little pin of Frederick Douglass on here, an abolitionist, that these are the types of concerns that typically happen when you address institutions. There are people who believe that certain forms are happening, that there's nothing inherently wrong with the institution itself. It's just some tweaks or changes or a less cruel version of it. And then there are those who believe that the institution at its core needs to be done away with or drastically reduced in order to make room for something new. And so a lot of people may have heard the term defund the police. And a lot of times it's been criticized, it's been supported. And I just want to make sure that people understand the understanding behind that. Me personally, I've also run for city council. I work a lot with local budgets, state budgets. I worked in the last General Assembly in Virginia where we abolished the death penalty, which I'm glad to have been a part of. But when we really understand policing, I want to also make sure when we're talking about violence, that we're understanding the only form of violence that happens isn't someone losing their life, right? Dr. King and Coretta Scott King talked about in 67 to 68, which was a very tumultuous period around policing as well. We saw two commissions that happened that year. One was on the problem of crime in a free society. And then we also saw the Kerner Commission that came out, which saw that due to systemic racism, that we have two Americas, and we're one black, one white, and then that the institutional racism is increasing that divide. That's why Dr. King in 67 and 68 writes, where do you go from here, chaos or community? He talks about in the civil rights movement, which was very much confronted and inhibited by the institution of police. He says that we have to expand our definition of violence beyond just the Ku Klux Klan and policing and hoses being released on people, and understanding the systemic and economic violence that occurs. His last movement, the Poor People's Campaign, was also about budgeting decisions. And he had led Resurrection City, a fun thing to look into. His wife, Dr. Coretta Scott King, talked about violence, about ghetto housing and economic violence, cutting subsidies for the poor in order to help out different corporations. And so there is a form of economic violence and struggle that happens there as well. So when we look at local police budgets, the way that I like to present it is a story that we talk about launching pads and landing pads. And I encourage people to say, now imagine if you were booked a plane and you wanted to go to, I don't know where some people want to go right now. Hopefully people are vaccinated first, but people that might be going to Miami, people might be going to Costa Rica, wherever you might be going. I imagine you go and you see the most lavish lobby while you're waiting for your plane. You go in, everything looks like it's first class. They got the screens on the back, everything's cool. You take off. It's the great, smoothest runway you've seen in your life. It's like on butter. And then a couple hours later, you're about to go to your destination. The clouds move back and the pilot says, we're about to land. And what you see is nothing but a dirt road. And you land, the plane's spinning, and you're also kind of wondering, this seems like this airline kind of has their priorities a little bit backwards. This is the same thing that I describe when we talk about the funding of policing. In many places, public safety is the highest budget that you'll see at the local level. Some places, such as Richmond, which I'm proud to say, we've actually started funding education a little bit more. So if we want to say that education is the launching pad or the runway of where we have people, where that is funded, the second highest thing is where you would hopefully anticipate where you expect people to land. As Dr. King said, the budget is a moral document of priority. And often the second highest thing budgeted, even if your city has achieved education yet, is the carceral system, right? And so where are we actually building and expecting people to land throughout this society if we're not able to talk about budgets? And so then even with what police are tasked to do, we understand this with teachers as well, and throughout the period and transition of policing, if you want to go back to night watch and constables, and then maybe you need to get into slave patrols kind of more so in the South, then you get into when there was I think President Hoover also actually disbanded policing in a way because it was connected to the political system, and they were doing some union busting. So with the different forms of policing, there have been different philosophies on what is the role of policing been, which I'm sure the chief can give a great history about that also. And so when we talk about public safety, we're having a lot of issues with people encountering police who have had mental health breakdowns, people who have struggled with autism, like the young man Elijah who was killed. What do we do with people who have, even when we think about Ma'Khia Bryant and being in foster care, and actually her her being in foster care because her grandmother was homeless and actually lost access to their home and trying to find a better place. But when police are called in at that moment, and in a moment where it only is a split-second decision, versus having intervention and prevention funded equally a little bit earlier, there are ways to circumvent that violence. But if the highest funded thing or the alternative policing doesn't get the same amount, then we're not able to see and really build an alternative for it. That's why I believe in more so of a strategic transition, right? Because the violence that happens in policing isn't just when somebody gets killed. And of course, we're glad to see justice for George Floyd, but justice is also more expanded beyond just the end of someone's life, and such of the services that they receive. And so when we think about civil asset forfeiture, or highway interdiction, or even the struggles that I think it was back when Giuliani was mayor of New York, and the Mullins Commission that showed, it was called The Anatomy of a Failure, the Path to Success, that actually showed the problem in corruption and brutality and really happening in minority communities, and saying that the struggle of policing was how can you be tough on crime, but also high on respecting people's civil rights and constitutional rights. And so there's all sorts of things that can happen that are problematic with the institution of policing, beyond just someone losing their life. And so how do we diversify who is actually addressing these issues, and how can we actually fund that and actually find better responsibilities for those, so that because the conversation on reimagining public safety, it has to be more than just a monopoly of public safety, meaning police, right? As if for those who believe in capitalism, it's the belief that the free market should produce competition so that the public gets the best product. And because when there are monopolies, there's not that ability to really have a competing model. And so when we talk about reimagining public safety, typically these conversations go certain ways. It actually gets into building and funding a different model for public safety. But then there's also ones where it's just adding. It's like a browser. Are we talking about adding a new browser, or are we talking about adding more tabs to policing, right? Where housing, mental health, all these things kind of gets housed under policing instead of staffed separately for that. And so that's why we certainly believe in those types of things. And we believe that those things are possible. And we also want to make sure that we, as we're having this conversation, that we aren't just talking about the things that need to happen, such as qualified immunity, ending qualified immunity. We have civilian review boards with oversight, hopefully with subpoena power, that are kind of coming in with this. As my dad says, people don't do what you expect, they do what you inspect. So making sure that we have police transparency for when things act out, but also the funding and the wealth extraction that happens from minority communities that have been reported from the Kerner Commission to the Mullins Commission to the various, you look at the gun trace task force in Baltimore and the reports that came from Loretta Lynch and Vanita Gupta under the Obama administration that talks about the various civil rights violations that happen. Those are real issues that need to be addressed. And also we have to make sure that the people who are most impacted by the negative side of policing are also able to state what they want to imagine within this conversation. And so the reason why we have to fund these types of things is because we have to be able to build an alternative that is practical. And again, there are people in other professions that actually are trained at a higher level in order to do this at a higher level of nuance as well. And also understanding that this is a process that needs to happen over time. As you look over the cycles and the periods of this conversation throughout the history in the United States, a lot of commissions get formed, a lot of difficult conversations get had, but we're aiming not just for difficult conversations, we're looking for different conversations, and we're also looking for difficult decisions and different decisions to lead us to something different. So this time we are living in is not specifically unique. What we can do to make it unique is to make sure that we are examining different ways forward. But I think one thing we can agree on, where you are on that spectrum, is that reducing the scope and scale of policing and providing a myriad of services for people that are best fit for a lot of the issues that we see within our communities. I'm a son of a preacher, and I can go really long as well. So I'll stop there, and I'd like to listen in input as well.
So thank you. That was, again, these are really hard issues. So I know that, we're going to have a difference of opinion. When we were talking about this session, and Lisa and Alan Charles and I were talking about it on Monday, we can all agree that we want change, and we want the system, a system to be fair and just. We can all agree with that. How we're going to get there, there are differences of opinion. And so I'd like to turn it over now to Chief Jim to talk a little bit about what are some of the reforms he's seeing or people are pushing for. We know the George Floyd Act is in Congress right now. There was some movement on it. I don't know exactly what's happened to it in the last day or two. But also, that really gets into no chokeholds. You're talking kind of some basic, that's like the floor. So I think that's what Alan Charles was really getting at, is that there's so much more out there that has to be done. So Chief Jim.
So first of all, it's just Jim.
Okay.
I'm not a police chief anymore. I'm just Jim. That's just me. So I'd like to say, first of all, that I agree with everything that Alan Charles said. I didn't hear him say a word that I disagreed with. And Liz, to kind of follow up on something you just said, that the progressive police chiefs and sheriffs that I know, the progressive cops that I know, would agree with you that the outcomes that we all seek, there is common ground there, that we all agree on the same things. I don't know one police chief or sheriff that thinks it's okay that the police consistently, since we've started tracking this, or I should say the Washington Post did 2015, that it's okay that the police consistently kill, in spite of all the reforms, about 1,000 people a year. That's an outcome that they would like to stop and see change. The police, I don't know one police chief, one cop, street cop, one sheriff who thinks the police should be the first responders to cases of mental illness, homelessness, or substance abuse. The problem for them is, so within the policing culture, the cops are generally salute smartly and say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, to whatever the political bosses have determined is going to be their mission. So they just go do it. In many cases, like those three instances, it is not in their best interest to do this. If they could go back in time, they would have refused to do this. I started in policing in '78 and retired as a police chief in 2011. And I worked for the National Police Foundation as its president. And the National Police Foundation is the country's oldest nonpartisan, non-membership police research organization. It was founded in 1970 by the Ford Foundation, whose mission is to advance policing through innovation and science. So I have a science lens, an evidence-based lens that I put in front of policing in terms of trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work, and to engage communities to reduce crime and disorder. What's very clear to me is that if the outcome we seek is a reduction in crime and disorder, then we have to think of how we go about doing that, first of all, differently. But we need to think about it kind of like we think about tripods or three-legged stool. There's three pieces to that the evidence supports, and that's prevention, intervention, suppression. So when we think about some of these shootings, right, the young girl that was trying to stab another girl who got shot that was in foster care, why was she in foster care? If you think about prevention and intervention issues, if society, if government had sought to prevent the situation that her mother found herself in, that then resulted in this series of events that results in this young girl losing her life, if government had thought about that as an outcome around public safety, then maybe we wouldn't have watched that tragedy unfold. When I was the police chief in the late 90s, we decided that the purpose, this is kind of a spiritual orientation of policing, the purpose of our police department was so much bigger than enforcing the law, that it was really about controlling crime before it occurred, prevention and intervention, and supporting strong families, resilient youth, and sustainable neighborhoods. And that was our mission. That was the mission of the police department. And very soon we discovered that we didn't have the organizational tools to really do that. And that the other government systems in my community, so I'm from Southern California, my hometown is Redlands, California. It's about 60 miles east of LA. It's about 80,000 people. We needed more tools in our organizational toolbox because we were following an evidence-based approach called risk and protective focused prevention that was aimed at reducing 5 adolescent problem behaviors: substance abuse, delinquency, violence, dropping out of school, and teen pregnancy. We had lots of community partners. We collaborated with a teaching hospital, community partners, but our organizational toolbox was not adequate. So we went to the city because we were trying to identify and then reduce risk factors and enhance protective factors. I don't want to get too technical about this. We went to the city and said, we don't have these tools. So they gave us housing, recreation, senior services, code enforcement. So I was the director of housing. And so one example of how we thought differently, the housing people before us gave out money. This was in the time in California when we still had redevelopment agencies, and we had what's called redevelopment set-aside money that we could use to help people become first-time home buyers and rehabilitate their homes. The entity that was running that in the city did it on a first-come, first-served basis. We changed that completely and said, where does this money need to go to make the biggest difference? So instead of giving it to absentee landlords, which is what happened a lot, we made sure it was going to people, families that wanted to be first-time home buyers. And then we did the same thing with rehab money. We took the community center and the recreation component of the city and said, it's not about leisure activities for kids. It's about giving kids positive pro-social things to do in the after-school hours, especially when their parents are having to work and they can't afford childcare. So we implemented a whole series of things, extended the hours of the community center to 2 a.m. So that we could provide those opportunities. And we used that city facility and another one as cold weather shelters for homeless people. The reason we did this in many ways, and the reason we were able to get away with that was twofold. One, I used my bully pulpit as the police chief to say, this is about controlling crime before it occurred. This is about giving people what they expect out of public safety. We have a bias for action. Now, we just didn't do this unilaterally. We had lots of community partners that told us where we were right, where we were wrong. Sometimes all we did was bring the facility to the table and other people did that. We funded several after-school homework centers that were run by faith-based organizations that are still in effect today. We had the property because we were the housers, or we bought the property and we rented it for $1 a year to some community-based organizations. So for us, this was about fulfilling kind of the purpose of what the police department was like. We're supposed to be doing in our community. Now, I retire, then I go to the foundation in Washington, D.C., where I get a really good education in how diverse policing is in this country, how in some places it's really good and how profoundly bad it is in other places, how really integrated it is in many communities, how completely disconnected it is in many other communities, how there's high levels of accountability, transparency, trust, and confidence in the police, and in other places it just is completely absent. One of the weird ironies, I think, in policing that people may not understand, but on some level it doesn't even make any difference, right? Is that when I think back on my career, when I got involved in policing in the late 70s to where it is today, it is so qualitatively, it is so much better than what it was when I started. But it doesn't, in many ways, that's irrelevant, and it doesn't matter because for so many communities, their tolerance for over policing a lack of humanity and empathy in policing, police misconduct is so far past the point of tolerance that it doesn't really matter, and it's irrelevant to them that if I say policing is qualitatively better, but it is. Police reform, to me, is kind of a mixed bag. If police reform did what I was hoping it was going to do when we really started seeing this push in during the Obama administration, then the number of people the police kill every year would have gone down, and that really hasn't happened. But I do believe that those reform efforts are worthwhile to pursue. We should be doing them. They're good because they make policing better. They advance policing. But where we're missing the boat, it really is at the state houses and the city councils that have the legislative power to say certain things. So when Congress says we're going to outlaw chokeholds, people have got to understand what that means. They're not outlawing chokeholds in my hometown. They're not outlawing chokeholds in California or any of the other 49 states. They're outlawing chokeholds. If you receive federal money, you have to have a policy that says you have to outlaw chokeholds. Most police departments don't take federal money, so it's not going to do that. But having said that, I'm not saying—
That's a very important point, what you just said. Can you—
Well, yeah,
there's like, what is it? At least there's like 18,000 different police. Yeah.
So this is part of the problem in the United States. We have more than 18,000 independent police agencies in the United States. Some of them have no business being a police agency. Some cities have no business having their own police department. And this is where the George Floyd Policing Act is valuable, because for the first time in policing that I'm aware of, at a really substantive level, Congress is trying to create a linkage between federal money coming to cities and counties and states and certain standards for police behavior, which need to be there. There are some things that will probably apply nationwide, like the registrar of police misconduct. It just boggles my mind that we don't have this because of the way bad cops can go from one place to another, and some agencies don't do this. So I'm a big fan of this. I've endorsed this. I think Karen Bass is one of my personal heroes about this thing, because she's doing it. But we need to extend that more, in my opinion, to not just say, if your police department takes federal DOJ money, we need to say, if you take any federal money, if you take a dime of federal money in any way, shape, or form, this is what you have to do. Here are the standards by which, because there is no national coherence around policing. And we've got to create something. Otherwise, we'll have good policing in one part of the country and bad policing in the other part of the country. And, from a police officer standpoint, they hate this, because good cops in good departments trying to do the right thing get painted with the same brush that people will paint the Derek Chauvins of policing, that this is what they do, when in fact that's factually not true. But we've got to find a way to say police reform is important. But what is the thing that we need? There's a couple of things we need to do. First of all, we need to engage and embrace the concept of community-led policing, where the community owns the police department. The community has the central say in what kind of policing you want. This is not difficult. This is the promise, the unfulfilled promise, by the way, of community-based policing. So we need to do that. And to do that, you have to listen. And so elected leaders also need to say, what are the things we're asking the police to do? And we're going to have the intestinal fortitude to say, we no longer want you to make traffic stops or enforce this law. And the state legislatures need to remove those things from the book so they can't be enforced, if we're serious about this. And I'll just say lastly, and then pitch it to Lisa, and comment on this later if we want. I'm a big fan of thinking about the police use of deadly force in the same way that John Kennedy in the 60s talked about going to the moon, the moonshot, putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade. I believe it is possible, given sufficient political will and resources, that our next moonshot should be stopping police killing by the end of the decade. And there's a variety of ways to do that. Some of them are policy, some are training, some are other things. But we've also got to find a way to replace firearms that the police use. We've got to find, this is a technological solution probably, but if we can put a man on the moon in the 60s by putting enough effort and money behind it, I believe we can find a way for the police to use something that doesn't kill people while they control people they believe are dangerous to themselves or others. And until we replace that firearm that cops carry, we're going to see even good cops shooting people because they've made a mistake. They thought somebody had a gun and they didn't, and that may be an honest mistake. I'm not talking about the bad cops who are doing other things. I'm talking about good, hardworking, the kind of cops we'd all want to see making a mistake. If they made a mistake with a device that couldn't kill you, then at least you don't die. They still made the mistake, but you didn't die. When you shoot somebody with a 45 and it's a mistake, you're dead. So I've got other thoughts and comments about lots of stuff here, but that's it right now.
So there's so much to talk about and so many questions, but thank you for clarifying the George Floyd Act and some of the things that are on there and what the federal government can actually do. I do want to say one thing as you were talking and you were saying how there have been police reforms, or at least things that are now being part, that are critical in policing.
Right.
I was watching SVU, Special Victims Unit, SVU, and you laugh, we all laugh, but watching some of that get into popular culture. And I know this because we worked with people out at UCLA and USC who work to get things into the scripts. One of them was on looking at rape tests that were sitting backlogged, thousands and thousands and thousands. When they put that in one of these episodes, state legislators started passing laws and getting through the backlog. So, I mean, it's kind of silly, but you realize how important it is. On there, somebody came back, and this person had used to be quite violent with arresting people and interrogating people. And they actually had a conversation about how they can't do that anymore. Anyway, I just thought it was fascinating and how it gets into the our popular culture, because that was clearly written in. So anyway, Lisa, I want to turn it over to you.
Well,
because your work
Liz, on that note,
yeah,
it is. And actually what you say about popular culture is so crucial, because when you think about popular culture and you think about policing, there is policing, which Jim explained to me is the adventure of policing, where departments reach out to people who are adventuresome by nature and attract them into policing. And then we get policing, which results in behaviors that are different, and they may not be compassionate. They may not be the empathetic policing that Jim talks about. So all of this, I often say it's an enormously complex problem, as I learned from Jim in studying this and working in this for the last couple of years. And to some, it sounds like a cop-out, but it really is. And so what Alan Charles is describing, and that is the systemic nature of what's going on. Well, the systemic nature of policing is also what is shown on television, which is what is attracting officers to be police officers who result in departments, and then things happen, and training may not be what it is, because as Jim pointed out, some departments have no business being police agencies, and we have tragedies. Who were attracting to policing? That's part of popular culture.
Yeah, and they also took, you remember the show Cops? They've taken that off TV as well. I mean, that was, the tough guys. That certainly was not that fast cars and guns was not helping communities' conversations around what they want policing to be. This is the issue for our time. I really believe it. And it's police to peace. A lot of people look at our name and it says it all. We are working through policing to peace, because police cannot be left out of this conversation. They are, as Jim explained, the most public face of government in any city, town, or county. They are right there. If you see, that is the representative of it. And as Jim also pointed out to me years ago, it's a state-sanctioned activity without pre-authorization, where they could detain someone and even take their life. So you have that awesome responsibility, and
Then you combine it with, as Jim pointed out, 18,000 separate entities, which are governed by 18,000 police chiefs and sheriffs, subject to local laws and state laws, and not very much subject to federal laws. There's no federal policing. Now what do we do? How do we reimagine that? And the truth is, it's community. And so as I've heard Jim say a number of times, communities get the policing they're willing to settle for or the policing they demand. And Alan Charles is describing what Jim actually did back in the 70s and 80s, policing, asking the community to reimagine policing for their community and coming up with the co-production of public safety, where Jim was the head of housing, handing out housing and redevelopment loans. Now, what I see, though, with our foot in the social justice world and in Jim's world of policing is that, so Alan Charles would like less policing. He thinks, you know, removing all of those activities and just having the police respond to crime would be a vision of America. And I would disagree, Alan Charles. I don't see an America that is well behaved enough to have no police. I don't. While there are 1.2 guns for every American citizen, that is not a place we are going to be right now. And even in countries where there aren't guns, like Great Britain, they have a knife problem because people aren't armed, but they have knives. So we may not be well behaved enough as a population to not have policing. So is the conversation less policing or more policing? And I think that's on a community by community basis that to be decided with government, so that communities get the government, the policing that they are inspired by and they desire. So I often use the phrase when I do talks on peace, of the people, for the people, and by the people. Of course, that's Abraham Lincoln. And so Jim corrected me. He said, what about policing of the people, for the people, and by the people? But it has to be done in every, there is no one magic wand we could wave in order to make policing better in this country. And that's why this is the conversation for our time.
Okay, so Alan Charles, you started us off. I'd like you to jump in and talk a little bit about some of the things you've heard. I do want to ask, though, is there, we've heard a lot about Camden, New Jersey, that they did community policing. There's some critics there if you look at it, but people point to it as a model. The DOJ went into during was kind of one of their final things they did under the Obama administration, and signed a resolution order with Newark, New Jersey. And last year they reported that there was no shootings, no police shootings in Newark, New Jersey. I want to ask you, where is it being done well? What do you really think is where it's being done well? And then Alan Charles, I want you to jump in as well.
Jim, is that a question for Jim?
Yeah,
Alan?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I missed that. If that was, is that question for me?
Where is it, if you had to say, this is the model, right? Because we keep talking about models. And I was just talking about Camden, New Jersey as one that people always go to. Right. Is there a, what would you say if you had to choose one or that's doing it the best?
Well, I mean, it depends on how you define best, but the place that I think that I would have people take a look at is what's happening in Stockton, California. Stockton is a very interesting place. It's kind of in central California. It's had in the past a very high crime rate. I think it went bankrupt. It's had tough economic times, but it's a place where the police chief has been focused on trying to reconnect with the community. And so he led an effort to have a truth and reconciliation. I don't know if it was, I can't remember if it was a commission or a process. And he apologized to the community for transgressions that the police committed long before he was ever a cop there and up to that current day. I mean, he's a big believer in the truth. When I was at the foundation, we did a critical incident review of a bank robbery pursuit shooting where the police accidentally killed the hostage. And it was a no holds barred. He didn't try to whitewash anything. He didn't try to hide anything. think a lot of police chiefs said, well, he's probably going to lose his job over this because he's being so transparent. And in fact, just the opposite happened. Anybody who knows anything at all about human nature and policing knows it's all messy and things happen all the time and they don't go the way you always want to. The question for all of us is what happens when that occurs. I think when you are thinking about the role of the police and the role of public safety and how you achieve outcomes, you have to not only think about, we use the term reimagining policing, but I also think it's more than that. I think we need to evolve policing beyond just the reforms, which frequently are working around the margins, but you have to think broadly about what's this new model of public safety and policing within that. And in Stockton, the chief's name is Eric Jones, is not afraid to talk about harm reduction, including the harm in the community that may have been imposed by the police, by his own agency. And I think that's an acknowledgement that has to be made in many communities before you engage the community in a meaningful discussion about where the police are going to be. I personally have a great deal of confusion about let's abolish the police suggestion, just because I don't know who's going to respond. If you get rid of the police, then who's going to respond to active shooters and rapes and all these other things. I think rethinking this and evolving the police so that they don't do all of these things makes a lot of sense. And so Stockton probably ticks as many of those boxes, especially on the community engagement and the truth piece about the harm policing can cause or has caused is a place I would have people start looking. And then there's other aspects of policing that other places do this right and other places do this right. I wish I could tell you there is one police department that comes to mind that does everything right. It's the perfect police department. And personally, I don't know where that is. I think we could make one. I think if we did it right and we had the right political will and the right funding, we could in fact create a place that all of these pieces work together. But I'm not clear where that political will is. There's political will to change the police, but then they don't want to listen to the police about what they're doing. There's political will not to change the police, and they don't want to listen to the community who says this doesn't make any sense. We got to stop doing this. So, I think the politicians have been able to avoid responsibility for a great deal of where we are in policing. And I'm not trying to pass the buck from policing. Policing owns a lot of this, but the politicians who are the bosses of the police chiefs of this country need to stand up and say they're responsible for where we've been and where we're going.
Okay, thank you. And one of the big things is you have to get at those contracts, those union contracts as well. And I know that's what they did in Camden. Alan Charles.
Yeah, so yes, I do have some thoughts on this. So I think, I know a popular phrase right now is Black Lives Matter, but as Dr. Greg Carr points out, typically when we're talking about policing, we're not having a Black Lives Matter conversation, we're having a Black Death Matters conversation, where the role of policing is typically just examined in what happens in the death of a person. And just for example, when Nancy Pelosi, after the Derek Chauvin case, comes out and says George Floyd gave his life so that we could have change in policing, as if policing is a vending machine of death where Black people have to enter in a dead body in order to get a better system. Anything that operates in that aspect is not a fundamentally peaceful institution. And so when we have to actually talk about restorative justice, right? Because if the lens of public safety is simply prevention, intervention, and suppression, where does actually restoration actually happen along that scheme? If we want to talk about active shooters, the FBI actually did a report that examined active shooters between the year 2000 and 2013, a study of the pre-attack behaviors of active shooters in the United States. It actually found that when they were looking at the pre-active behaviors, a lot of them were economic stressors, a lot of people that were more apt to actually catch those things if they were under the age of 18 were teachers and peers, another public-facing institution, which I think people have interacted with a teacher more often than perhaps they have police. And then also, it also talked about that within that research, that when people actually did, out of the percentage of people that actually did report it, the 46% of those, the police actually had interactions with these active shooters before they actually performed this, and that a lot of the active shooters, unfortunately, killed themselves. And by the time police actually got there, you know, it was a tragedy that really couldn't be intervened upon. So I don't really like to politicize active shooting, but I think it's there's a lot more to that issue. And so when we talk about Black Lives Matter versus Black Deaths Matter, it's not just about making policy decisions and funding to make sure that Black people don't get killed, but making sure that my goal is not making just policing better, but it's actually making communities better, because the livelihood of a community is measured by way more than how many police are present during that time. So for example, I wish that our police department here in Richmond had a greater dedication to housing. But in the reality of what's happening here in the city of Richmond is that we have city council members who are making $4 million of cuts from the tax relief program that helps to house the seniors and the disabled within the community in order to give a raise to police, right? So we're actually talking about, as I talked about, this moral document, not just, of course, we don't want to see Black people dying at the end of this, but where it's not just about, here's a dead body, let's do better. But what about the actual livelihood of those types of things in those things? When we talk about, you talk about active shooting, a lot of the, I think it said about 43% of the people did it because of the employment environment or some type of iteration or response to that, right? And of course, it was 66% white, 17% Black. But some of the stresses and grievances within this report actually talk about the economic indicators that drive people, these types of things. It's the same type of indicators that we see towards crime and things such as that. So if we know that those are things that are preventing that, and I agree with the rhetoric of what Mr. Bierman is saying about identifying those resources, but the rhetoric often doesn't match the resources and how things are funded, right? So here in the city of Richmond, the police department is funded literally 99 times higher than the Office of Minority Business Development. It is funded over 80 times higher than the Office of Community Wealth Building, right? So it's great to lift up these ideals of certain communities that are getting it right. I say you can learn from that, but also that also has to come with budgetary decisions that come with that, right? Also, one way that police departments fund themselves is through civil asset forfeiture, which the Department of Justice from the Obama administration, from people to Rand Paul to Justice Sonia Sotomayor, talks about it greatly targets Black and brown communities. There was even one year where civil asset forfeiture took more money from Americans than theft and a lot of the criminal reports from the FBI combined. Now, I know you can make data say anything. Now, part of that had to do because that was a year they did a big seize on the Enron bust. But though there are ways that we can incentivize people federally, I do believe that what Chief Bierman is saying, one of the things, the reforms that I think needs to happen is we have to go back to the cuts on civil asset forfeiture that happened under Eric Holder and the shared and the federal sharing program. It was cut under Trump. I still haven't heard what President Biden's plan is, but if the plan is to gain incentive to get people who are receiving federal money, for example, here in Richmond, we only got a federal grant a little bit for, I think it was under the CARES Act to help get protective gear for police officers, but they're getting way more money consistently from a civil asset forfeiture in a sharing program. Some of that has to go through the state and how they set those things up with the Department of Criminal Justice Services. But if that's a way of federal money that we know is happening, if they're not going to crack down on it, they admit and could at least incentivize it. If you're going to do this and or participate in these federal sharing programs, then that's something that you have to do as far as the chokeholds and other things such as that. So there are some federal ways to do that, but a lot of the stuff that's going to be happening is at the state and is at the local level. And so when we're actually talking about how do we build and resource the life of Black communities who are typically catch hell on what it costs to reduce crime because of the civil rights violations, whether that's through surveillance and all these other types of things that have been going on. it has to be, if we're talking about building Black lives and not just preventing Black deaths, that is going to have to get into a budgetary decision. And so many times, the lion's share of that budget is being held up by police. And so when we talk about what is it going to mean, again, I believe in a strategic transition. Anybody that I've talked to who believes in abolition is not talking about doing it tomorrow or doing it in 2 years. But I think that we have to be able to build and fund those alternatives so that this becomes more of a practical conversation as people actually have the opportunity within those communities to build the system that they do want to see. And again, and the problem with laws is, when you think of it, training, culture will beat training every day. So there are people that have these rules. For example, there's a young man here who was killed, Marcus David Peters. He had critical crisis intervention training, and he still shot this person, even though it was very clear that there was a mental health breakdown that was going on. Even though a Virginia state officer recognized it and told him not to shoot, the person still did. And so the training and how that actually plays out in culture, and again, as an act of love towards police officers, it's also not best to intersect them at the end of a process to make a split-second decision where there really aren't any winners that can happen. But when you're actually looking at who the data says the determinants of these types of things are, that's great to say, but also, are we resourcing the institutions that are best trained, best equipped to actually deal with those? And is it okay that once we, over time, build and resource those alternatives, that the responsibilities can go from police and also the resources can as well?
So thank you, Alan Charles. Are there any, any other comments in terms of, so what do we do practically, right? So, I think you laid out a couple of pieces in terms of with the George Floyd Act, and I know that's being discussed right now. Any changes or edits to that as well. I think you were gonna say something, Alan Charles, on that? No, okay, just, I guess I'm just trying to get at like the most practical pieces. Obviously, there's, as we talked about before, there's the floor, we need to stop police involved killings, and especially they disproportionately impact especially Black men. But then again, how do we practically, and it's hard because you have to go to the state and the city level, and I know, Lisa, I know you're working on that too, but yeah,
when you think about it, Jim pointed it out, and that is the political will to do something in every community is what's needed. So in Jim's community, when he was police chief, there was political will to actually solve the systemic problems, focus on youth, focus on housing, focus on houselessness, focus on these issues. In communities where there isn't, they're going to get the policing they're willing to settle for. Because if the community members don't speak up, and they elect officials who are doing those kinds of things, and they approve the police budget, and they don't make any of these changes, it's a stretch to blame the police, quite frankly, in that situation. Because as Jim says, they will salute smartly, yes ma'am, yes sir, and go about what they're told to do by the political leadership. The police chief reports to the mayor, an elected official. So when we reimagine communities and policing, as we are doing around the country, it means to uplift the community. What is uplift? It literally means to bring communities of color and other historically underrepresented groups up to the level of service, up to what is enjoyed by other people. That's what Alan Charles is talking about. That takes political will. It takes moving money around. Then when you do that, you imagine, and as Jim pointed out, pardon me, you have to make amends. It's been done in the furtherance and in the name of public safety. We know that. For communities greatly impacted by that, as Jim points out, they're not moving forward until that's acknowledged. Is there a political will to acknowledge that? Not always. Okay, I'm not sure how much it is around the country.
Okay, so, if this is a political will issue to change the budgets, change how we're getting at prevention, and that's prevention not just from shootings, but prevention from the issues, the social issues, the economic issues that are impacting people. how do we change the political?
If I may,
Sure.
I do want to say, I don't think it's a fair characterization that police are just standing by and standing outside of the political and advocacy and policymaking process. This is someone who's worked in this General Assembly session that has had bills such as decertification and banning chokeholds and all those other types of things, and the types of emails we received from police officers and police unions that were against those things. It's not. I would love to see some good apples writing some emails in for when it's time for decertification, when it's time for funding the other things about the determinants of health that we say we're trying to address. So I think it's
well, that's
not
because,
a fair
Alan Charles, you can't say policing is monolithic. In your community, you got those emails. In other communities, they may not. That is the issue. It is both the strength of America and its Achilles heel, and that is it is so hyper local that in your community you got that. You can't say that about every community. It would not be factually true. And I'm not sticking up for bad cops and bad policing. With that said, there are so many types of communities and so much policing. That was your experience. And so what we say when we work with communities is go in and change that at your level. But you can't say that all policing is like that. That's not true.
We can speak about the racial disparities in the prison system. And when you look ahead, if you can't get into a prison without running into police. So I think we have to be a little race brave here. And again, bringing up the elephant in the room about the racial disparities and the racism that has been inherent within policing, that has been founded, whether you want to talk about what Loretta Lynch and Vanita Gupta, who's now over the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ. So hoping to continue that work. These are not, we can't just individualize the things that we don't like to hear about policing and then take one city for like Chief is talking about, which I'm glad he did that work, but we can't also say that that's everybody's experience there. So we have to be fair on what we individualize and what we generalize. And so I'm saying that Richmond is not the only city that has this problem. If you want to do a poll of launching pads and landing pads and tell everybody in the city to look at their budget and see what's the number one, number two thing funded, I guarantee you, and why that number one spot or the number two spot is going to be public safety.
Policing is about 30%
exactly.
of small cities' budgets around the country. It's very expensive. Public safety is very expensive.
And it gets more expensive as you defund the things that actually help with the determinants of health. Because if I say defund the police, everybody throws their hands up. And when the city talks about defunding policing, defunding tax relief for seniors to help them stay in their houses, stop the things that actually would maybe change the trajectory of the life of Ma'Khia Bryant, who ended up in the situation that she was in, right? So I'm saying,
well, and this is what I'm saying. When he was police chief, that was in essence it was a redistribution of funding for the things that are systemic, which causes people to not go into the criminal justice system and results in a better society for all and better outcomes for everybody.
And
that's
as you
what
were
you're
saying,
talking about.
That is Jim's personal experience with where he was. I'm also glad that his city just declared racism a public health crisis, as we just did in Virginia as well. But how many cities have actually done that? But how is that? How much is that the reality before the resolution comes out?
That's why this issue is the issue for our time. There are 18,000 communities with municipal police agencies, and they all have to do this if we want better policing.
So it's a lot
on an individual level. There's no magic wand.
So awareness raising and changing the political will.
Absolutely, on a community level.
And so historically, and this is why I started the way that I did, and this is why I talked about the difference between a difficult conversation and a different conversation. These are the same issues that we were going back and forth about the Kerner Commission. This is the same thing that was going back and forth about the corruption that was in the Mullen Commission. These are the same things that are going back and forth that whether you're in Baltimore, you want to talk about the Gun Trace Task Force. We can name the cities, we can talk about the things that are there, right? But it's not enough just to have a difficult conversation. We have to have a different conversation, and we have to have a different decision that results from that. And so, again, as A. Philip Randolph says, there's political power and there's people power. Yeah. Right. And I'm sure these conversations happen. I'm not one that is surprised at conversations happening. I'm surprised when we start making those different decisions. And I'm glad for Chief and the different decisions that he made within his industry. And I wish that there were more ways in order to do that. But unfortunately, that has
Well,
not
I
been
think
the reality.
I would put, well, it hasn't been the reality so far. I would put forth, and Jim, jump in, because we've talked about this. What happened with George Floyd and Minneapolis changed policing. And so, and I'm aspirational, I do have police and peace in the same word, so we do a very specific thing, but to have police chiefs get on camera and on television and say, this is wrong, to have Charles Ramsey, Police Chief Charles Ramsey, say, this has to stop, voices in police leadership to acknowledge that. In my recollection, that hasn't happened before. Policing is like an aircraft carrier, as Jim has explained to me. How do you turn it? Slowly and carefully. But that's the only thing that's monolithic about it. It's that big. So policing, I believe, is moving and is changing. And I'd love to hear Jim's views on whether or not he agrees with that. And
also a question has come in around police unions, and I think that's what you were alluding to, Alan Charles, about the amount.
What's the systemic nature?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's police union contracts, there's a systemic nature to police union contracts, right, where it's a labor union. But Jim, I'd love to hear your views on this.
So a couple things real quick. So I think back to Liz's earlier question about what can we do individually. I mean, I truly believe that we have the form of government that we either demand or we tolerate, that we'll settle for. And so individually, most communities are not big cities, they're smaller cities. I think everybody can make noise in a constructive way. When you yell at people, sometimes you have to do that to get their attention, but at some point we have to stop yelling past each other. We've got to start speaking with each other about the outcomes we seek. So I tell people all the time in my hometown, I said, the city council is elected. The chief works for them. Go talk to the chief. Go talk to the city council. Go to the city council meeting. Get involved and say, I want to see different outcomes. I think the area, we started this whole thing by kind of talking a little bit about outcomes. The outcomes that we all seek, the outcomes I want to seek, is certainly the police stop shooting people, but I also want people, the outcome I want to see in our society is that people of color thrive and that they're not subject to police misconduct and abuse and all of that. And I'm a big fan of police defunding conversations. I think we have to have, so now I'll insert myself into my technical stuff about how city government works. It's not just the police when you're talking about money, it's also the fire services. How you spend public safety money, if you spend public safety money on public safety, taxpayer money on public safety instead of housing, I think there's something fundamentally wrong with that model personally. And you can't take housing money to give a raise to the cops. That's just fundamentally crazy in my view, but it happens all the time. I mean, this country is so diverse, we have crazy stuff happening all the time. But if you have a more rational city council, and if you don't, then you go talk to them. And if you don't, then you got to elect rational people there. And you got to say, so if we can create a model where the cops don't have to be the first responders, for instance, to these kinds of cases, that'll save you money. And you can reduce the number of cops you need, which are expensive for all kinds of reasons. And that's how you fund it. And it'll be cheaper. You fund those services cheaper than you fund police services. And then that opens the door to other things, because the cops are completely amenable to this, in my opinion. Maybe they're not going to like the reduction in their budget, but they do not want to go to these kinds of calls. So there's common ground right there, that if we can figure out a way for somebody else other than the police to go to mental health calls and homeless calls, they're all for this. I talk to the local street cops here all the time about this stuff, and 100%, the first hands in the room that will go up saying the cops should not do this are the cops. They don't want to do this. And then that leads to other kind of bigger discussions about the prevention stuff. This model I was talking about that we did was aimed at building resilient young people and strong, resilient families as a prevention. As again, our mission statement in the department was controlling crime before it occurs by doing all of these things. You have to fund those things. And we were using police department money that I had the ability to maneuver around, or I had some political support for, to do those kinds of things. I'm not suggesting that many police departments will do that, by the way. I don't think we're there at this point in our country. And I don't even know if the police today, if that's an appropriate role for them. It was for us at the time because nobody else was doing it. But we've got to have this conversation about outcomes. And when we talk about where it is we are trying to go, then that how we get there becomes an easier conversation, as opposed to just immediately going after the cops. And I'm not suggesting anybody is doing that on this call, certainly, but I will just tell you that if you want to see police behavior circle the wagons, if you want them to circle the wagons, then just attack them. Don't talk about changes, outcomes, reform, let's do better. Just go and attack them, which is happening a lot of places. And I guarantee you they're going to circle the wagons, but so does everybody else. And that's where union behavior kicks in. Cops have unions, the same reason that other people have unions. Police officers across this country have had their employment rights abused by police chiefs and sheriffs for years. And that's what started the union process. And then it goes to, salary and benefits and all those other things. And it has a synergistic effect. In my city, the fire union has a contract clause that says whatever you give the cops, we get on top of whatever you've already given us. So it just makes the city council crazy, because they do not have the intestinal fortitude yet to stand up to the public safety unions and say, we're just not going to do that. We're not going to. And as long as unions put money into campaigns, wherever they're coming from, we're going to see political influence affected by them.
I mean, just to note, once again, it was Camden, New Jersey. One of the things they did is they disbanded their police force and got rid of the contracts. I just also want to say one other thing. I posted something in the chat. Eugene, Oregon is one of the areas where they have been really putting a lot of money into mental health. So that those calls go to mental health professionals and not police. Theo, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Liz. I mainly wanted to kind of turn our attention to some of the questions that have come in, and Jim, I appreciate you mentioning police unions and the role that they play in providing benefits, employee benefits, and so forth to cops, but also connecting that with our earlier conversation around political power. And Lisa, to your point about if it's about mustering the political will, and oftentimes we do see police unions being a hindrance to reform efforts. So Charles, Alan Charles, sorry, I'd love to hear you kind of comment on that aspect of things. One other thread that I just wanted to pull out relatedly is that there seems to be kind of a disconnect between the reform efforts and the conversations that happen in Washington at the legislative level and what the social movement is calling for, what the organizers on the street have been calling for, right? And there certainly is that disconnect, and there's, seems like there's a lot of political will and a political organizing that is happening within those social movements, but there still seems to be a disconnect. So I'd love to kind of hear some commentary on that. Maybe Theo, Alan Charles, we can start with you and then go to Lisa. I'm
glad you asked that question, because it's been said a lot today. When you organize, you get what you want, but that's been a little bit ahistorical to the struggle of especially African Americans, right? When you can hear John Lewis's in his unedited speech that he was planning to give at the March on Washington. He talked about Danville, Virginia, being in a police state, and talks about the police. You talk about Bloody Sunday, you want to talk about Septima Clark, you want to talk about Fannie Lou Hamer and all the role of policing in preventing that, or even if you even don't want to take it out of the African American community, up north, maybe like in the 20s, policing were actually hired, talking about political will, they were hired by political people who put them in power to actually break up unions that were trying to get better power. So there's a power dynamic that policing has played, where you see people who have been organized, who have been doing this work to organize, display the people power that A. Philip Randolph talks about, that were very much met by police and brutalized by police, even over the summer. Richmond has topped since the protest and issues of police brutality, specifically around protesters, right? And we had people who were tear gassed. We had clergy, children, people who were tear gassed, who were just simply literally saying, we are here for love, right? Who were being tear gassed by police. We organized, we had hundreds of people show up and say that they wanted to see a reduction in the use of tear gas, which is banned in the United Nations, but still be able to be used on our people. And despite that turnout, people still told them no, right? People still, when they had a teach-in in front of the city council to talk about what restorative justice is, they were tear gassed by the police, right? So we still have to talk about the role of power in that, right? And so hey, look, we know that the police has union and organizing power, right? But what happens to the culture of those people when they speak out? Like the sister in Buffalo, New York, who actually spoke out against someone, a police officer using a chokehold, and actually was fired and couldn't get pension by her union, who just won her law case, who's just won her case in law, right? So there are these things that happen. So we can't paint this rosy picture. You have to talk about the realities and the historical role of policing in that, and how while there is a valid role of community policing and all those other types of things, like my good friend Carol Adams, who I'm friends with here in Richmond, but there's also the other side of policing that happens. The police chief that got brought in after they fired that one police chief, they brought in someone who had murdered an Air Force veteran and planted a gun on them. Then they said, oh, we can't do that. Then they had to bring someone else in who was fleeing a restraining order for the use of tear gas that he did in Mecklenburg, North Carolina, and they brought him there. So again, and that goes then with, how do we get a process of decertification so we're not just cycling these things through? But there's a real history of resistance from the institution of policing that happened that. And I'm not saying that we have to erase one to do those. We have to hold both of those in the light of what is going on. The same time in 1967 with Lyndon B. Johnson, when you have the commission on how do you deal with crime in a free society, you also have the Kerner Commission that talks about these realities. And so as the Kerner Commission talked about, there are these two Americas, right? As Dr. King talked about, the two Americas, right? There are two Americas, and there are two histories of interaction with police, on who police protects and serves, and who police over incarcerates, who police has the war on crime and the war on poverty, and all those things are on. And we have to make sure we're having and holding both of those realities. I think the temptation is, if you want one side, you want to ignore the other one. But I think we can hold those tensions because we're dealing in reality, right? The whole thing about public safety, whatever it is, whether it's more police or less police, it has to work for the communities.
But the reality is both. There's a national consideration and there's an individual community conversation, which is so hyper-local that it almost has nothing to do with the national conversation. That's the real tension. That's why this is the issue of our time. Police culture is absolutely at the heart of what we're experiencing in America. Department. What we do at Push Peace is, who do we want to be officers? Why did they choose that profession? What do they want to accomplish by being a police officer? Jim and I talk about this a lot. And so I think the culture of policing is at the heart of the discussion, but it is individual to the departments. There's no national culture of policing. And Jim, if you want to comment on that, I know we've talked about it many times. That is a very challenging issue
would like to
for the entire country.
With a couple of things. Number one, the movement that we had this summer is not a local movement. It was a national movement. It was a global movement. I actually, through peace building efforts, we're actually talking with the Dalit people who sit at the bottom of the caste in India and Nepal, and talking about how they saw our movement in America and said, just like you said, Black Lives Matter, we say Dalit Lives Matter, because we recognize those same models of caste and oppression, and we came in solidarity against that. And it is not a local effort because of the lack of decertification. I didn't say that,
Alan Charles. I said it's both a national, it's both a national issue.
Let me finish, please. It's not just a local issue. And this goes a lot to what Jim Bierman was saying, right? About why we need the National Registrar of Police Misconduct, because someone acts bad locally and gets hired a couple states down. And so the same cultures that are created, instead of them being caught within that culture and saying, you're violating our training, you're violating the laws we've passed, you're violating the reforms we had, they just eject. Or if somebody shoots somebody with a taser, with a gun and says it's their taser, but they're the chief of the police union, they say it was a mistake and they retire. Instead of being decertified, they just go to another place and plug into that police union, plug into that political landscape, plug and become the police chief there. And those same type of actions kind of start. And so we have this network, right? And that's why we need things such as a certification, which is why it enrages me when I see police officers talking about why we need to oppose that legislation. So again, I'm not wistfully pulling on, I'm not talking about a memoir. I'm talking about series and patterns of history that were here before I was even alive. And this is a continual pattern that we are in, and we are in this moment. And the reasons why I talk about we need to have different conversations, because if we have the same conversations that we had back then, we're going to still we'll fail to make this type of decisions that need to be made back then. And we'll just be passing on these things. As Amanda Gorman said at the inauguration, the things that we neglect to address today is what we give the next generation to inherit.
Well, I think we're addressing those, which is why we're having this conversation here, and thousands or hundreds of thousands of them like it around the country. And so when a police officer who did something like that is getting rehired, that's a local issue, Alan Charles. That was a local decision which allowed that to happen. Can there be national ways of addressing that? Absolutely, as Jim pointed out. But this is a hyper-local issue, and it's a national movement. And that's really the conversation. That's the issue that we're struggling with.
Well, and this is the problem with not having a national coherence, and but this is why we need this registry, because in a state like California, the state mandates that you do extensive background investigations on people, so that you wouldn't, in theory, you would never hire somebody like that, because the background investigation would reveal that they have done that, so you're not going to do it. But there are so many places where they don't even do that, and so you have to have a way to hold the police chief accountable. Almost 100% of police chiefs in the United States are at-will employees. So I ran for re-election, if you will, every 2 weeks. Every time there was a city council meeting, in theory, they could have decided to get rid of me. And at some point, if a police department is tear gassing people who are exercising their First Amendment rights, they're peacefully exercise, even if they don't have a permit, who cares if they got the permit? They're peacefully exercising a thing that the Constitution guarantees them. If the police tear gas those people, then you should fire the police chief and work right down through the chain of command until you get rid of those people, because there can be no tolerance for undemocratic policing. Even though there is, I want to acknowledge that, all over the place. At the end of the day, every police chief is working for a city manager who works for the city council, or they work for the mayor. And if you allow that stuff as the police chief, then you don't deserve to have that job. That's it. I mean, the police chiefs I still stay in touch with look at things that we see on the news, and it just makes us want to scream. We talk about this a lot, about how crazy this is, that a chief somewhere either doesn't pay the price or didn't intervene or didn't create a system to do this. And part of it is the way we train police chiefs. If you look at what the United Kingdom does, that you have to go to a police command college, essentially, that teaches you all of the things that you need to do. And if you don't pass that, you can't be a police chief. You can't be a police chief unless you go to this thing and you pass it, right? It's a graduate program. And if you think about, in most places, all you need is, education-wise, is a GED to become a police officer, to be the only governmental employee that without prior judicial review can use force against the people who pay his or her salary, including up to and taking their life. My own belief is you want the smartest, best ethically oriented, and best critically thinking people in those jobs if you're going to give them that kind of power, right? It's like if I have to have an operation, I want the most highly qualified surgeon doing that. And I think that this is one of the fundamental problems we have in this country, is that We don't mandate enough so that you force out of the policing business these little cities or places that can't afford to hire the right people, that won't raise their educational standards, that won't train them the right thing, that won't hold them accountable, do all that. And how you make that a national standard in a country that has states' rights front and center is very difficult. There are ways to do it, and we just need to do that. I mean, somebody asked a question about national standards. You have to have national standards if you can do it. But right now, I wouldn't put much money on Congress doing almost anything. I just think that Congress, as it is currently constituted, is not serving the American people. So it's going to have to come from the state houses. And if the state houses won't do it, then you have to do it at the local level. At the end of the day, all policing is local, folks.
So can I also ask another question in terms of how, are we at the tipping point? Did what happened last spring with the protests, and for the first time, a lot of white America saw what it was like to live in a police state. People that were down in Washington saw police officers, without insignias on, or there was tear gas in Arlington County here in Virginia. People complained when they saw Arlington police tear gassing people so the president could walk across the street. They called their police. How do we keep this, if that was a tipping point that actually propelled people to want to have this conversation and change, how do we keep that going?
Well, the first thing is you don't re-elect Donald Trump. I will just tell you this. He's the worst possible thing that has ever happened to American policing. Worst possible thing. And so people have got to pay attention to that, because he's probably coming back. I'll pontificate about this. Go ahead, Alan Charles. You go ahead. You pontificate for me.
Yeah, no, I think Donald Trump was certainly a resurgence of the worst of America. And even when you look at the progressions that we were able to make under the Obama administration, once Jeff Sessions got in there was not even just an effort to curtail them, but to actually undo them. And so it requires a lot of people being awake. Dr. King talks about, how do you stay awake during a revolution? He tells the story of Rip Van Winkle and says the worst thing about Rip Van Winkle is that when he went to sleep, there was one king, and when he woke up, there was another one. And that during this period of revolution, he was sleeping in on the sidelines. So I think we have to, as Thurgood Marshall said, after he won Brown versus Board of Education, is do not be sedated by success, right? We got one guilty verdict with Derek Chauvin. But that's not means we can wrap a bow on it, or even because we got Donald Trump out of office doesn't mean that we can just wrap a bow on it, right? There's a lot of work that needs to be done. People have to be aware of the things that are going on in them. And as James Baldwin said, the great force of history, as long as you are unaware to it, then you are captured to it. So I think, being able to look and examine and acknowledge the truths of these hard histories of policing allows us to stay awake and understand that there's a lot of change that needs to be done. And again, most of the ideological differences on whether you're defund or refund or all those other types of things, a lot of things have to do with what is that going to be in 10, 15 years. But there are some things that no matter where you are in that pendulum, that we can agree on right now. A lot of the things that the chief brought up at the federal level, national registrar, making sure that at the state level, that you guys are able to and a qualified immunity, that you're able to look into decertification, that you're looking into transparency. I believe that there should be police transparency acts that are released at least quarterly for people able to see their arrest records and what geographic areas, to see what type of racial disparities are kind of happening. I think the more transparency you can have, as my dad said, people don't do what you expect, they do what you inspect, right? And if you're not open to an inspection, then that's a red flag for me, right? So I think there are ways to do that, because no matter what we're talking about, it's not going to happen like that. It's not going to be a magic wand. It's not going to be a Disney movie where somebody drops a tear, and then everything just kind of goes back to normal. It's something we're going to have to consistently be aware of. But while you're fighting for whatever future you, in your radical imagination, have the right to imagine and dream and work towards, these are some things that I think we can certainly agree on. And I hope that we're able to also not that no matter where you are on the spectrum of what public safety looks like to you, I hope that you also have the opportunity to have that imagination funded as well.
I would just say, I don't think we've reached the tipping point. I mean, we have in certain places. You're right, Liz, that we saw things that we hadn't seen before in terms of who showed up at protests. But I think we take our eye off this ball at our own peril. And it takes a long time to change the course of this super tanker called American policing. And we just have to be persistent, which we're not as a people very good at. We're pretty much a microwave society. We expect changes to happen very quickly as the economy spools back up. How many of those white people are going to pay less attention to these issues because now they have to go back to work or whatever? I don't know. I'm a little concerned about some of that. But we just cannot let up. I do think we have to listen to each other, though. I think we need to spend a lot more time listening to each other and not talking past each other, because everybody has a perspective that is important to solving our problems. Together we'll solve them. If we are fractured and we polarize, I'll almost guarantee you we're not solving much of anything. We just make it worse.
Well, and that's actually what we're talking about, and that is how to really reimagine in your community. Go to your community and put in place a structure for dialogues that becomes a governance innovation, so that people have a voice. Civic society can share their ideas, can demand, can make changes in the way that both Alan, Charles, and Jim have talked about for their community. That is, while also on the national level, things can happen. You're absolutely right, registry. But all policing is local, and this is hyper-local. What we can do in our communities is that. Have those conversations, show up at city council members. Don't let 5% of the people in your community govern 100% of what happens, because they're the 5% who show up to the meetings.
So the awareness raising, keeping the issue in the forefront, things that need to get done on the national level, and people engaging at the community level is critical to this issue.
It's both.
Sorry, go ahead, Angela.
And I want to raise too, we talk about political will a lot, but I think it also talks with political courage as well. Mm-hmm. There are several systems that provided security to certain portions of America that they needed to have a lot of bravery and courage to imagine what it would look like without them, right? And so I think having the courage of saying this future that I'm building may require more of me at the community level than I might be comfortable with, right? It might make me have to examine more what bias or even racism my fears are based in, right? Because I do agree with the chief that, a lot of things happen because we lack a basic understanding of each other beyond the narratives that we're told about each other. And so I think if we're a nation that doesn't understand each other, we're not a nation that takes risks for each other, and it's going to require a lot of risks. I especially think of my friends, some of the white protesters and brothers and sisters that came out and continued in the tradition of so many people before, whether it's Freedom Summer and so many other people who came out and made those risks, who got police, who got arrested, right? Who got their mugshot in the paper and lost their job. You know what I mean? Like, that's because they were willing to go beyond the narratives and stories that may help them show up in a way that helped to really push this forward. So I just wanted to add that.
I think that is an incredible way to end this session. Political courage, political risk. You're seeing it right now in the Republican Party, when people just saying, the election was fair. It's going to take real political courage and difficult and different conversations with an immediate and a longer term, issues, the urgent immediate issues. I can't thank you all enough. This was a phenomenal conversation. And it's a hard conversation. And I just really, I want to thank you, all three of you, well, everyone, and for people attending. This is not the end of this conversation. And we'll be, AFP, it will be pushing this as part of our US issues, because it is such a conflict driver and drives instability, and is a spark for protest and outrage as well. So again, thank you all. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you.